When you're a kid, even the smallest inconvenience can feel like the end of the world. So, what happens when there's something bigger? When the world as you know it really does seem to end? Hello, people of the internet, my name is Atlas, and today I'm here to bring you something a little bit different. I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the darker elements of Deltarune, and I mean that literally. I'll be looking at things from a symbolic and thematic perspective to help answer the questions of what the Titans are, why the night is the way it is, and how it all connects to Chris, while also giving more tangible answers to questions such as what is up with Eram, and why Icy is so prevalent in the Dark Worlds. And hey, if you like this video, why not leave a like and subscribe so you can see more like it in the future? So, going into such a loaded topic, I think it's important to start on solid ground, so let's turn to Ralsei and see what he has to say on the darkness and the Titans. Starting with his basic explanation of the Dark Worlds, he tells us what I think most of us already assumed, largely clarifying the specifics. Dark Worlds are a darker dark, essentially the other side equivalent of mistaking an object for something else when it's normally dark. The difference being that the perception of these objects becomes a reality. It's important to note that while Darkners don't properly exist as conscious beings until a fountain opens, and likely aren't properly conscious once it's closed, they will, nevertheless, treat their time in the light world as if it actually happened to them, albeit in a somewhat exaggerated and fantastical way. Of course, it's also important to remember that Darkners, when in a fountain, are indeed real people. While we don't know for sure what makes something eligible to become a Darkener, it's not too far-fetched to assume it's the lack of soul now that we know that plants can become Darkeners. As such, it can be assumed that the fountain, along with providing them a new form, also serves as a substitute soul that grants them consciousness and emotions. Which makes some sense since fountains seem to be created through a combination of determination and magic, both of which seem to originate from the soul. As for Titans, they're a little bit different. Created when a dark fountain is created in a dark world, the second fountain seems to become the Titan itself, and unlike normal Darkeners, they have no consciousness, nor an item that they're based on. Ralsei describes them as the fear of the dark, the shadow on the backside of your mind, a description I find very interesting. If Darkeners are the equivalent of our skewed perception of an object in the dark, the Titans seem to be the yet darker version of true darkness, where you can't see anything. The unknown, where there can be anything, any size, and you'd have no idea. After all, the fear of the dark is usually not a fear of the darkness itself, but rather the fear of what could be in it. And when you reach true, perfect darkness, there are no limits to what that can be. This also explains why the light in our soul is what is able to take them down, and seal the fountains. If you're in a dark room, with only vague outlines visible, your mind will wander, make them out as something they aren't, but turn on the lights and the truth is revealed. In a room with absolutely no light, you could think up just about anything in the darkness, hear and see things that aren't really there. But turn on the light, and there's nothing. Something we literally see directly in action in Chapter 4 with the Titan spawn in the dark sections of the game, where Gerson literally just flips a light switch for them to disappear with no trace. This could even explain the lack of consciousness further, because the Titans are quite literally nothing. There's nothing to perceive, to project onto. This is also what Ralsei means when he calls them the shadow on the backside of your mind, and says that they've been here all along. Because truly, the Titans can only function properly because we are giving them that power. Without our minds, the darkness is empty, but with it, it can be filled with anything. This reading also provides an explanation for the Titan spawn. When your mind is wandering, it will often do so exponentially. Suddenly, one potential threat becomes 2, 4, 8, and before you know it, your heart is pounding outside of your chest, having images of a whole array of things that have it out for you, all because you thought of the original. You might be wondering then, why is the church a wreck after we seal the final fountain? And while we technically don't know that this was because of the Titan, perhaps the knight tore the place apart looking for the code or something, an angle I prefer is that if you were in a room with no light at all, trying to fight something that isn't there, well, it shouldn't be a surprise that a few things are broken once you flip the switch back on. My point is, darkness represents the unknowable. The darker it is, the more room there is for misinterpretation, for illusions to become your perceived reality, which also works with the fact that it's the soul that has the ability to wash the darkness away. After all, not only is it something grounded in reality, being the very essence of a lightener, it's also connected to us, the player, something even more real than the light in Deltarune. We're almost the exact opposite of the Titans, which could explain why they have design elements commonly associated with angels, why they appear as a realistic human head before the unfurling of their wings, and their gigantic size. So with that in mind, knowing that these forms of darkness typically have a real-life equivalent, I think it's also worth taking a look at the Roaring, the end of the world. After all, given what we've talked about with the Titans, it feels strange that they could end the world if they're not even truly tangible, even speaking symbolically. Well, for one, I think part of the reason they have such great power comes from the same reason they're able to exist in the first place. Just as there is limitless potential for what could be lurking in the dark, there is limitless potential for how powerful it could be. Plus, while it's true that these real-life spirals cannot physically hurt you directly, that doesn't mean they can't have a real effect on you. Perhaps in an attempt to stop these thoughts, you hurry a bit quicker back to the safety of your room, only to bump into something on your way and get yourself hurt. Maybe you aren't even able to get any sleep that night because you're too busy worrying about something that wouldn't have even existed conceptually if it wasn't for you. Obviously, this isn't anything as big as an apocalypse, but it does demonstrate how something that isn't real can still have a destructive impact. It's also worth noting that the Titans only appear to be one part of the Roaring. As Ralsei mentions things such as the Earth shattering and Darkness turning to stone, neither of which seem to be a direct consequence of the Titans' actions. So what do I think the Roaring symbolically represents? Well, if you remember the very beginning of this video, you may already have something of an idea. It's important to remember that in Deltarune, the main characters we're dealing with are kids, troubled teens at that, and the prophecy that includes the Roaring is intrinsically tied to them, so whatever it is, it would make sense to relate to them specifically. I believe the Roaring, the end of the world, symbolically represents how when you're young, it's easy to think that the world is ending, that your life is over. I think the inclusion of the Titans adds on to this. As stated before, Titans represent the unknown about as much as they represent the dark, and when one of these world-shattering events happen, one of the scariest parts can be the lack of knowledge about where things go from here, and I think this is only added onto by the appearance of the Titans in the prophecy. As I talked about in my last video, two resemble the Knight, who I'm just going to assume is Des for the sake of this video, and one resembles Asgore. If we are to assume the Roaring is something of a representation of Chris's world falling apart, this makes quite a lot of sense, as both Asgore and Des symbolize the two biggest tragedies and changes that resulted from this chain of events. I think this imagery is also pretty sad, as it could imply that Chris may be unable to see Asgore and Des-related things without forever associating them with what happened. As much as I'm sure they'd love to be able to just appreciate them in a vacuum, that just isn't possible with how things went. The fact that there are two Titans that resemble Des is pretty interesting too. Perhaps because while with Asgore it was really just one major event that affected Chris in particular, with Des they've had to deal with both her initial disappearance as well as her reappearance as the Knight, in which they seem to have been put in a situation where they have to do things they clearly don't want to. Funnily enough, the fact that Susie is known to like giant monster movies kind of adds to this idea, I think. I've already explained how the concept of the Roaring as it's been established connects to Chris, but after Chapter 3 we now know that the connections between Susie and Kaijus is not just a one-off thing. We of course got to see her play one in the SusieZilla minigame, but more notably, she also has a poster of one in her room, which gets distorted by darkness much like the chair. Now admittedly, I understand if you're a bit weary about this connection, given the kaiju stuff so far has been pretty lighthearted. But I do think it's interesting that the whole concept of a giant monster going around wrecking things without rhyme or reason sort of darkly reflects Susie's own character, and the insecurities she likely still has regarding herself, seen in Chapter 4 as she clearly feels conflicted about her main thing being a violent and destructive form of magic. It may have been fun before, when it all felt like a game, but now that things have gotten serious, that she's fought an actual giant amoral beast, I doubt this comparison would be quite as pleasant for her nowadays. The kaiju connection could also speak more broadly about the nature of Deltarune's apocalypse, as the idea of giants bringing the world to its end is an idea that has been a part of many of Earth's cultures for a very, very long time. Other aspects of it also seem to be inspired by other theoretical ends of the world as well. Be it the Earth crumbling away, fire filling the sky, a bunch of people suddenly disappearing. Perhaps this is because it's how the people of the world of Deltarune perceive the concept of the end, especially kids. While adults may have more sorrowful, mundane thoughts on how everything will end, ask a kid how it could end, and you're far more likely to get something fantastical, much like what we see in Deltarune. But perhaps I'm getting a bit too meta here, and these similarities are just Toby himself being inspired by different ideas. Let's get back on topic then. It's also possible that Susie is the reason for the second Night Titan. Given that while the world-shattering event for Chris happened quite some time ago, I'd say Susie's happened in Chapter 3, because of the night. There's also the fact that the Darkners apparently turned to stone during the roaring, which, to me, very much gives the impression that the escape they offer is no longer effective, as the despair brought on by this event is far too oppressive to be dealt with via the unreal. The fact that the legend says it's only after the Earth draws her final breath that the heroes save the world also gives me the impression of the fact that sometimes when bad things happen, you have to accept that they did so you can pick up the pieces, and move on to a better future. Something relevant, as Chris is likely doing what they're doing in some attempt to restore their life in some way or form. And it's also just generally thematically relevant to Deltarune, with subjects regarding Toriel and Asgore's marriage, Chris and Noelle's relationship, and perhaps even Rudy's illness. The lyrics to both Don't Forget and Raise Up Your Bat also support a symbolic reading of this subject, as they work being read both figuratively and literally. In particular, the lyrics, when the light is running low and the shadows start to grow, and the places that you know seem like fantasy, show this off greatly. On the surface, this phrase appears to be referring to the creation of dark worlds, which obviously involve the shifting of the balance of light and dark in the favor of darkness, and more importantly, literally turns the places in town that Chris is familiar with into fantasy worlds. At the same time though, I'd honestly say the figurative reading of the song comes more naturally to me, with the darkness referring to the darkness in Chris's life, and the people and places around them hardly resembling the town they once knew when they were little. Similarly, the ending of Don't Forget mentioning the light in Chris's soul and the promise in our hearts is of course referring to the soul's ability to shine past the dark, and perhaps Chris's promise to the caller. But through the more figurative view of things, the singer is essentially just telling Chris that they have what it takes to make it through this rough time. After all, the soul is not just us, but is also the culmination of Chris's being. And no matter what, the singer is right there with them, even in spirit. Honestly, given the potential implication that Des and Azrael may have been in a band, I wonder if it's written so that the literal meaning is from Des to Chris, and the symbolic meaning is from Azrael to Chris. Though perhaps that's a discussion for another time. Speaking of, there's also Raise Up Your Bat, which once again talks about your heart being able to light you the way. Also being able to be read multiple ways, but more important to my analysis of the roaring specifically, the singer calls the audience to raise up your bat and face the fright, a line given more meaning now that we know that the Titans are the fear of the dark, while also being a more general line of encouragement, telling the listener to face their fears. A similar meaning can be attributed to the line, when your hope is slowly dying and your future's lost its rights. Obviously, if the world is ending, that applies, but it's also a pretty apt description of how these dramatic events can feel, how they make you feel totally hopeless without any control of your life and future. Gerson also talks about something similar during the tea scene in the Weird Route, in regards to what Chris is going through, mentioning how it can feel like they're just going through the motions. All the while, they have to deal with the same responsibilities they've always had to, and more. That it all feels pointless, and most importantly, that it almost feels like an insult that the earth is still turning. I can't help but wonder if this could provide some insight into the night, or perhaps even Chris's motives, given how much both seem to have suffered, and are presumably planning on bringing the roaring, even if they don't actually want the world to end. Just some food for thought. But either way, it is another instance of a traumatic event being brought up in regards to the concept of the world ending. And like both Don't Forget and Raise Up Your Bat, Gerson's monologue ends by telling Chris to keep going, that it will all work out in the end, even if it doesn't seem like it. Just like how, even after the Earth dies, the heroes will still save it in the end. Now, I've mostly talked about Chris here, but the night is also, of course, quite relevant to this discussion. After all, they're the one making all this darkness in the first place. And I think with what we've established regarding the Titans, I may potentially have an answer as to why they seem physically similar to them. And when I say that, I'm referring to the whole being made out of darkness thing, not just their body types. You see, if the Titan represents the fear of the unknown that darkness brings, then it would make perfect sense to have the Night, as Des, being utterly consumed by this fear. Not just because she herself has been stuck in the dark, but because she went missing. We have to remember, after Des disappeared, it's likely that no one had any idea of what happened to her. Even if Chris was there for the initial events that led to it, it's likely that they wouldn't know the exact fate that she had met. And when there are no answers, no leads to follow, the minds of those who knew her begin to wander, and project into the unknown. Did she die? Was she kidnapped? Did that thing that you saw down there get her? If she is still alive, and does come back one day, what if she's a completely different person? Unrecognizable from who she once was? I think the knight's design helps further support this idea, considering it appears extremely gangly with what seem to be exposed bones, as if it's malnourished, if not already dead. If Chris and Des really saw Gaster or something Gaster-related in the bunker, the shared motif of the holes in the hands makes sense as well. The knight is also abnormally large, which I find notable considering Des likely went missing when she was around Noelle's age, and based off of her sprites compared to those of her parents, she had plenty of growing left to do. There's also the Fallen Star book, which could suggest that part of the knight's transformation came from her own bitter tears. It's hard to say for sure, as it describes the tears as glass, something both black shards and shadow crystals are compared to. Either way though, I can't help but wonder if it's not just her own sorrow that resulted in her ending up the way she is. There's also the fact that Des seems to be a known cryptid hunter based off of the Icy Sweepstakes page, and seems to have potentially been something of a doomsday prepper considering the rashes in her room, and implicit fascination with the bunker. It would make sense that someone who believes in the supernatural and the potential oncoming of the end of the world would become a being bringing both to life. There are also some anomalous Darkners, beings in the Dark World that do seem to have a corresponding item, but don't work the same as traditional Darkners. I think a fairly relevant example of this would be Friend, who not only appears in multiple Dark Worlds without us bringing it to them, but might even be able to appear in the Light World? Now, that isn't necessarily guaranteed. Perhaps Friend somehow led Des to the shelter in a less direct way, through a video game or something. But either way, it implies a level of consciousness and control in the Light World that other Darkners simply do not have. Now, as to why this could be, well, the game has established that if a Darkner absorbs the soul of a Lightner, they can persist even in the light. Perhaps somewhat symbolic of how fiction can influence the real world based on its impact on an individual. But that does leave us with the question of, if Friend has a soul, whose soul is it? Also, if this were the case, you'd expect it to appear in the Light Worlds when the founds are sealed, but it doesn't. To be completely honest with you, I'm not entirely sure how it could appear in the Light World otherwise, though. Perhaps it's made of the same stuff that the Knight and Titans are, which are both implied to be able to do the same. It does have the same pitch black body and white outline that they do, albeit with a splash of color in its eyes. Considering Des's cryptid hunting tendencies and eventual status as the Knight, perhaps she was somehow able to believe Friend into existence, especially since it isn't exactly unthinkable that she could have learned about it from Noelle's spooky creepypasta-esque encounters with it. And a potentially much simpler answer to this could be that the bunker fountain is a grand fountain, which could function in a way that allows Darkners that originate from it to behave in ways that others can't. After all, both a shelter and supply closet are meant to store a variety of things for a large amount of time. This brings me to our next subject, Ralsei. Like Friend, Ralsei can travel between Dark Worlds, despite not being an item that we hold. Ralsei's Light World equivalent isn't quite as cut and dry as Friend's, but many candidates have been proposed, and I think the most popular is indeed correct in this case, the Horned Headband. Representing Chris's desire to fit in with their family, along with their general identity issues, it makes sense that it turned into a Darkner who looks like their brother, has identity issues as his main thing, and the real kicker, has a pink scarf that's called Red while also having pink horns, eyes, and being nearly the exact same height as Chris. Now, given Ralsei's character and struggles, I'm inclined to believe that the way the Dark World conceptualized him was not just as what Chris wanted to be, but rather what they thought they should be. A small but crucial difference. It could also explain why Chris is a little bit conflicted on Ralsei at first, despite his kindness, and adds a bit of humor to them desperately explaining that he isn't identical to Asriel, as they'd essentially be defending their own pride here. Now, as mentioned before, it isn't unthinkable that part of the reason Ralsei can do what he does is that he's from a Grand Fountain, and I do think that's part of it. After all, it's presumably why he can exist in other Dark Worlds without any issue. However, I'd also like to suggest a more meaningful explanation as to why these creatures of darkness can exist how they do when others can't. As I've explained, the way that Dark Worlds work is based quite heavily on the perception of the Lightners, determining the personalities of the Darkners, the lighting, and more. Specifically, I would like to suggest that the reason beings like Friend and Ralsei work the way they do is because they represent concepts, ideas, and events constantly on the back of Chris's mind, with Friend representing a traumatic event from their childhood, and Ralsei being an issue Chris has dealt with for pretty much their whole life. This could also explain why Ralsei always arrives in the Dark Worlds a little after Chris and Susie, despite being able to sense them and seemingly teleport to them on demand, and why he waits for them to wake up in Chapter 3, though I suspect the real item equivalent is indeed in Castletown, if this is the case, as it's generally implied that he's there even when we aren't, and he says himself that he's waited there for us to arrive. However, there is one more character that I believe falls into this category, that I have saved for last, and that is Eram. Now, Eram's inclusion here is not quite as well founded as Ralsei and Friend, because we honestly have far less of an idea of what they are. Like, we don't even know with 100% certainty that they can appear in other Dark Worlds, though I'd argue the fact that they take residence in a virtual shelter implies as much. Now, what do we know about Eram? Well, for one, considering Toby's typical track naming conventions, I do believe Eram is meant to be its name, originating from the mare part of Nightmare backwards, which we can pretty safely assume to be the case based on the code referring to it as the Nightmare Boss. Speaking of which, it has quite a few connections to the Knight, being one half of the Chapter 3 secret boss plotline, with the Knight and them literally coming together to form Nightmare. They also have fire magic, a connection to the bunker, dark horns, a connection to the Titans, a connection to Chris, the black knife motif, and one weird mouth thingy as their only facial feature. However, despite these connections, I don't think Eram is actually the Knight, for a multitude of reasons, including their apparent revelry of the weird route, the existence of the black deer and the sword route, and perhaps most concretely, the fact that they are more than willing to just actually kill Chris, which the Knight never does because, well, they're working together. As mentioned, Eram also has a strong connection to Chris, wanting them to indulge in their darkest impulses, and knowing them well enough to taunt them into it. Chapter 3's Shadow Crystal route is also more geared towards Chris in general, with both the weapon and the armor you get being customized to Chris, as they wear both a mantle and wield a sword normally. So then, what exactly is Eram? Well, as I said before, I think there's a good chance that there's something similar to Friend and maybe Ralsei, but that then begs the question of what item or concept gives them their form. Well, for starters, like Friend, I imagine its origins lie in the bunker, considering that's where we find it in Mantle. I can only assume when we eventually venture in there, we'll find the true Eram inside. Now, considering Chris has almost certainly been in the shelter, Eram could really be almost anything. I mean, Friend was from Noel's Cat Pedders game and just left, so I don't even know if we need to limit ourselves there. What I think is really telling, though, is the ability to get into Chris's head. This isn't something that the other Chapter 3 Darkners really have, despite having likely spent even more time with Chris. So whatever this item is, it would have presumably been used in a way that connects them to Chris further. This brings us to what is probably the most popular idea for what Eram is: the Horn Headband. Now, as I established before, I do believe this is the best candidate for what Ralsei is. As for how those ideas could work together, well, it's possible that the headband could have been broken at some point, and Ralsei and Eram are from each half respectively. Though, notably, from what we saw with Tenna, something like this would most likely just result in a Darkner's death under normal circumstances. Still, I understand where it's coming from considering the Red Horn door, which we initially go through to hear Eram. And I do think this is a hint to their identity, I just think it's not quite that direct. After all, the horns represent everything Chris thought that they should be, while Eram seems to be everything they think they shouldn't be. So then, what do I think represents this idea while functioning similarly to the Red Horn headband, while essentially being its opposite? Something that could easily have ended up in the bunker. Something that Chris could probably wear. Something that could shift who they are. Become part of their identity. I think the key to this question lies in two words: burning eyes. This is the name of Eram's battle theme, and partially refers to the fire in Chris's eyes that Eram is able to spark by poking and prodding them. However, it also quite interestingly relates to one of the only sweepstake pages that seemingly had no payoff, the Icy's Cryptid page, where Noelle got spooked by an Icy's pizza box, does try to burn it, only for the eyes specifically to be burnt out. Then, Chris wears the box like a mask to scare Noelle, making it so their burning eyes are looking through the box's burning eyes. Des then throws the box away near the graveyard, right next to the forest, and we never hear of it again. I believe Eram is this Icy's pizza box. Think about it. Not only does it make the burning eyes thing come full circle, it explains why Eram doesn't have any, their connection to Chris, to Des, the fire attacks, and even their behavior. If the horn headband was something Chris used to try to fit in and be more like their family, the pizza box was something they specifically used to scare Noelle, which makes the sword rout's connection to the weird route make even more sense. Of course Eram would say Chris enjoys the weird route. Their whole involvement with them was a moment where Chris hurt Noelle. Though I'm obviously not trying to vilify them for that. I don't think we're supposed to think Eram is totally in the right here. The idea that Eram represents the parts of Chris that they're ashamed of also provides another explanation for the Titan symbolism, since, as I've pointed out, they don't seem to be enjoying themselves upholding their promise of theirs. Plus, if Chris is really trying to repress that part of themselves, perhaps Eram would also reside in the shadows on the backside of their mind. Perhaps that's why they're hidden in the first place. This even connects to the Nightmare Fun event in Undertale, as while they aren't identical by any means, they do share a similar mouth shape and a name. Plus, the newsletters and Chapter 4 have made a weird pattern of giving Snowman's horns through the addition of sticks. And this isn't just a holiday thing either. Noelle has a picture of Chris and Asriel doing the same. Though, thinking about it, you honestly could argue that Asriel was making one modeled after Des and Chris Noelle. Still though, the concept has been introduced. Also, some of the differences in design could be explained by the fact that Eram is apparently holding the Shadow Mantle, which may obscure their true form. And this is where things get really juicy, because I think this explains why Icy has appeared in so many of the Dark Worlds. I think, just like the appearances of Friend, this may be Eram's influence. Why do a bunch of Icies come through pipes covered in shadow? The same reason Friend appears in the church, similarly obscured. Chris also seems to have a strange connection to Icy, being filled with dread when they see he's getting replaced for copyright reasons. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the thing that they replace him with is Nightmare. Plus, just like Susie takes the Susie statue to her room, Chris takes the Icy statue to theirs. Which, if this theory is correct, is them also taking a statue of themselves, or at least a part of them, just like Susie does. And what do you know? In Chapter 4, we take the statue to Ralsei's room, the anti-Eram. This also gives an interesting meaning to a small subplot related to the sword route I haven't seen anyone discussing. During the sword route, Ralsei is preoccupied playing games the entire time, and seems completely oblivious to what's going on with Chris, which gives his darker equivalent the chance to swoop in and do what they do. It also gives him even more reason to be off-put by the Ice Palace entrance, though to be fair, I think he has enough reason for that regardless. Hell, if Eram is like Friend and can go into the light world, maybe they're secretly Purple Guy or something. It is weird that they seem to be wearing an entirely different mascot suit, and have this cryptic test encounter in the code. Probably not though. He's probably just a weird FNAF reference. Maybe. And of course, with what they represent, Eram would share the same reasoning as Friend and Ralsei for their appearance across Dark Worlds. Also, notably both Ralsei and Eram have anagrams for their name, with Ralsei being associated with dreams, and Eram nightmares. And so that is my take on the dark side of Deltarune. Literally, of course, there are honestly, figuratively, much darker subjects in this game. But nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed, because I most certainly did. I love doing this type of analysis and had so much fun laying everything out for the Eram theory. I'd love to hear your own interpretations in the comments. And hey, if you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to show it. It always means a lot. Speaking of, I don't even know what to say in regards to the success of the last video, so I'll just say thank you. I honestly wasn't even sure what kind of video I should make after it, but I ultimately decided it would just be best to try and make a good one that you and I can enjoy. All that being said, drink water, remember to floss, and don't forget. The impossible is possible. All you gotta do is make it so. Good night.